on vous encourage à vérifier s'il y a d'autres équipements qui utilisent l'Internet juste pour vous assurer que vous avez accès. Donc, vous allez pouvoir bien suivre la conversation. Et on vous rappelle aussi que cette activité est enregistrée. Donc, on vous souhaite une excellente soirée.
Thank you, Albert. If for any reason you get disconnected during this event, you can use the same click on and rejoin the meeting very easily. We'll keep an eye on if anybody's in the waiting room and we'll bring you forward. And a final reminder, if you need tech support at all, please let us know, send a message in the chat, and we'll try to take you aside into a breakout room and try to deal with any technical support issues that you may have. There is the feature, the chat feature, and this is where my dog barks. There is a chat feature. We're going to encourage you to put in your comments. We're going to encourage you to put in your comments and about the meeting. And if you have any questions, put those there as well. Albert, do you want to finish this off and I'll go and you can continue? Albert?
Yes. Oui, donc c'est ça, on vous encourage. Si vous avez des commentaires, des questions, n'hésitez pas à les écrire via la boîte de conversation. Puis si jamais vous vous déconnectez, vous pouvez toujours revenir. Si vous avez des questions aussi, on va pouvoir, au niveau technique, on va pouvoir aussi vous appuyer. Donc, il faut juste nous faire signe via la boîte de conversation. Merci.
Lastly, I want to introduce very quickly Mark Marico. If you'd like to mute yourself, Mark is going to do the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Deborah. We would like to acknowledge the gift of being on Anishinaabe territory and specifically on unceded Algonquin territory. I'd also like to recognize the two closest Algonquin First Nation communities of Kitigan-Zibi and the Algonquins of Pikwakanagan. We also recognize today that Ottawa is the gathering place for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Canada. This land acknowledgement commits us to the original relationship that we were building together based on friendship and peace.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. And now it gives my great pleasure to introduce the host for the evening, so she could make a few opening and welcoming remarks. I'd like to turn it over to Lucille, our Provincial Member of Parliament at Queen's Park. Lucille.
Thank you. Merci, Deborah. And welcome, everyone. Bienvenue, tout le monde. I'm really, really pleased to host this forum on a very important issue. It's an issue that has mobilized a lot of attention and that people are interested to solve, judging by the number of people that are joining us tonight. I believe that it is an issue that deserves attention, that deserves collaboration, and that deserves solutions. The sad event of the summer that we've seen happening in the United States, across the world, and even here in Ontario, have highlighted the ongoing reality for people of color. And I say sad events not lightly. I have 4 children and they were quite affected by what they were hearing and seeing on the news. And it's with tears in her eyes that my daughter begged me to do something about this. So the forum tonight is not only a reaction to these sad events and the fact that I should be doing something because I am an elected official. Having the discussion tonight is also important because I believe that as a society, we have a responsibility to our children and to the society of tomorrow. When we realize that people around us are suffering unjustly, I believe strongly that we need to do something. Sur le forum de ce soir, c'est pas seulement une réaction aux tristes événements qu'on a vu se dérouler les derniers mois qui ont vraiment mis en lumière l'injustice qui se passe pour les personnes de couleur. Alors, la discussion ce soir, c'est vraiment une réalité pour nous de réaliser qu'on a un devoir en tant que société, on a un devoir envers nos enfants et on a un devoir envers la société de demain. Quand on voit des gens qui souffrent de façon injuste autour de nous, je pense que c'est notre devoir de réagir. J'espère aussi vraiment que ce soir que nous allons retirer de bons conseils sur les façons d'apporter des changements positifs ensemble afin d'améliorer la confiance entre les communautés racialisées et la police et le système de justice. Ça serait trop facile de tomber dans le blanc, mais ce n'est pas le but de la discussion ce soir. Il s'agit vraiment de voir ensemble comment nous allons pouvoir concrètement apporter des changements positifs. And I want to be clear that I have great respect for police services and the people who serve the law enforcement. And this discussion tonight is not about defunding or denigrating our police. It's about having constructive dialogue. It is about making positive change together. And to help us do this tonight, so we have the privilege to have representatives of the communities that are affected, that will share their experience and the need for reform in our institutions. Because I believe that any societal change needs to start with our youth, we are also going to hear from an inspiring young woman who I'm working with currently to propose a legislation at Queen's Park that would include learning about race and ethnicity in the curriculum of education in Ontario at all levels. And finally, we are also fortunate to have with us two advocates that have initiated some measures to address this issue through either their past or their current role, and they'll be talking to us about their expertise. So I'm also glad to be joined tonight by Councillor Rawson King, who himself has been a leader in overcoming systemic racism in Ottawa and is continuing to do that at City Hall as councillor. He will be moderating the discussion tonight, and he will be presenting in more details the members of our panel tonight. So I will pass it on to him so that we can get started. And I hope that we can all learn something useful tonight, something positive to take away and to do things better. So on to you, Rawson, and I look forward to the discussions.
Well, thank you, Lucille, and good evening. We have 6 great panelists tonight, and we've given each of them a specific speaking assignment. I will introduce each of them in turn. After they've all given their opening remarks, I will invite them to comment on each other's statements. Then I will open the floor for questions or comments from the audience. Feel free as well to express yourself via the chat feature, which we will monitor throughout the evening. At the end, we will return to the panelists for a final round of comments. Our purpose tonight is to have a constructive conversation about how we in Ottawa and in Ontario can move forward positively in eliminating systemic racism from our police and justice system. I look forward to hearing from everyone. Our first speaker is Yasser Naqvi, who is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Canadian Citizenship, Canada's leading voice on citizenship and inclusion. Yasser is the former member of Provincial Parliament for Ottawa Centre, who served as the Attorney General of Ontario, the Government House Leader, Minister of Labour, and Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services. He is a lawyer by profession and teaches part-time at the University of Ottawa and Carleton University. We have asked Yasser to describe the legal and jurisdictional context of the police and justice system in Ontario and how it permits systemic racism to perpetuate in this province. He is well placed to do this as he was responsible for the latest reforms to the Ontario Police Services Act as Attorney General in the Wynne government. So at this time, I'd like to pass the virtual mic over to Yasser.
Thank you, Councillor King, and thank you to MPP Kolar for organizing today's session. And it's a great honor to be here, and really happy to see so many members of our community faces that I recognize from our community. In particular, I just want to give a shout out to Reverend Bailey, who I see is with us as well. Thank you, Reverend, for all the great work you do in Ottawa. We have a limited time. I thought that I just set the stage for you in terms of the breadth and scope of legislation that regulates policing in the province of Ontario. And when I speak about province of Ontario, I think the issues probably equally flow when it comes to federal jurisdiction or other provinces and territories as well. But before I get into that, I just want to make one point, and that is that the issue of systemic racism in our policing and justice system is not new. I think what we've seen during this pandemic is that this public health crisis has really exposed, perhaps magnified, the fault lines in our society and the systemic issues that we've been living with for some time. People with lived experiences, people from Indigenous, Black, and people of color communities have been talking about, it just are more front and center. And so perhaps this is a byproduct of this pandemic, that there is a sharper focus on issues around systemic racism and other systemic issues in our society as a result of this pandemic. When I was in office under Kathleen Wynne's government, we recognized way back in 2014 that we needed to modernize and reform our policing legislation in this province. George Floyd is not the first person killed by police. There have been Black men who have been killed in Ontario way before the murder of George Floyd. And so these issues has been up in front and center for us to address. So we started that work back in 2014. In fact, Madeleine Mayer was who was the former MPP for Vanier, was the Minister of Community Safety and Correctional Services, and then Attorney General. And then I took over the role from her as the Minister of Community Safety, and then later on as the Attorney General. Our policing legislation in Ontario had not been looked at or modernized in over 30 years. So we felt very strongly that we need to do something about it. Therefore, we engaged in extensive consultations across the province, looked at literature, looked at the data and evidence, and also international best practices. And as a result, in 2018, we tabled the Safer Ontario Act, a very significant overhaul of the police legislation. There were four focus of that legislation. One is to enshrine the notion of community policing as a legislative way of doing policing. So in other words, prevention being key as opposed to just a policing system that is reactive in nature. Number two, to strengthen civilian governance of policing, to make sure that police services are reporting to a more robust civilian infrastructure. Number three, to further strengthen oversight of police, to make sure that when there are allegations of criminality or misconduct, that police are not the one who are self-investigating, that there is an independent police oversight system. And number four, to ensure that we have a robust First Nations policing that is being run by First Nations, not non-Indigenous communities, police services like the OPP. We were able to bring that legislation. We were able to pass that legislation before the 2018 election. Election happened. A new government came into office, and the legislation to some extent was revamped. But I would say that it was kept pretty much as a whole. The real issue now, in my view, is not that we have legislation that is problematic. The real issue is now the proper implementation of that legislation to ensure that we are taking all the appropriate steps in consultations with communities to implement that legislation. And I will raise three key areas where work needs to be done and where systemic barriers and obstacles need to be broken down. Number one, in police oversight, to make sure that the legislation that we had brought forward, which by the way, was complied with every single recommendation that Justice Michael Tulloch, the Justice of Ontario Court of Appeal, the only Black judge on the Ontario Court of Appeal, gave to Ontario government that those recommendations that were brought into legislation be implemented to really create an independent police oversight system. Number two, racial profiling. Racial profiling, unfortunately, still is part of the policing culture that needs to be dealt with. We brought in the regulations dealing with carding. They were a very important step. We were the first jurisdiction in North America to ban carding. We asked Justice Tulloch to look at our regulations to tell us if we got it right. He has done a comprehensive report making further recommendations as to how we can eliminate racial profiling from policing. That report should be fully implemented. That's another important step needs to be done. And number three, I would say the most important one is training of police officers. When it comes to use of force and when it comes to police interaction with people with mental health and addiction issues. This is where I think the most impact can be made. There has been ample studies done, reports by the Ombudsman of Ontario, a study by experts at University of Toronto that have developed the blueprint on how to create police training that focuses on de-escalation, that reduces the use of force as a tool. And that's where I think we see the kind of violence that we see towards racialized people. And that's where most of the work needs to be done. All those studies, all those blueprints have not yet been implemented. So, Councillor King, I will stop here, but I just want to highlight that in my view, when you ask where the systemic challenges lies, is around police oversight, it's around racial profiling and training. And I would suggest to you, training is probably the biggest piece when it comes to use of force and people with mental health and addiction issues. That's where the work needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yasser. And our second panelist tonight is Richard Sharp. He is a federal public servant and currently Director of Racial Equality, Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion at Justice Canada. He is an activist and a speaker on addressing systemic racism, anti-Black racism, and how to be an ally with the Black Lives Matter movement. He's a founder of the 613-819 Black Hub, as well as the Federal Black Employee Caucus, who has worked within the federal public service and union leadership to address anti-Black racism in the federal public service. Tonight, Richard will address the problem of systemic racism with the police and justice system from the perspective of Black Canadians. Richard.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice again to see so many familiar faces, Yasser and Reverend Bailey, and of course, Ralston and the others who are on the line. It's too bad we continue to have these conversations, but they're important nonetheless. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, which is always very difficult for me. Talking about these issues is really, really close to my heart. I see this as in terms of policing and addressing systemic racism in the justice system and policing is really a matter of life and death for our people in this country and in fact in North America. I've ended up devoting, I realize now, and as I'm in my 50s, devoting the greater part of my life to working within institutions and within communities to address these issues at a systemic level. And so part of that has to do with understanding where this comes from and why we're here. Why are we here having this conversation over and over again, decades after people have been having these conversations? So I will say that, just to talk briefly about policing and the justice system, we have to go back to the foundations of Canada. When Canada was basically created and our first prime minister issued those words of making sure that Canada remains white The first institution that was created in this department, federal institution, was the Department of Justice over 150 years ago, 153 years ago, I think, to be exact. And that department was really put in place to ensure that there were laws and regulations to subjugate, discriminate, and keep Canada white. So it's very difficult for an institution that was founded under those principles. And I think that's part of my challenge in my new role, is to work with an organization to unpack some of that, to see how that those foundational principles govern how the institution works today. And it helps to explain why Blacks are 3 times more likely to be, 3 times our representation in the federal systems, and in some cases we make up more than 50% of jails, provincial systems across the country. So that has to do with the foundation of what justice is in this country, and why it doesn't work for us. And I do appreciate the work that people have been doing to try to reform and to make changes. As Yasser mentioned, in terms of the work that he was doing while he was in government, work that the Justice for Abdi Rahman Abdi Coalition did, and trying to press for changes to policing and legislation, that sort of thing. All of those are commendable and laudable efforts. But again, we do need to, I think, and I'll sort of talk to this a little bit later, but really reimagine justice and how justice is meted out in this country. It is quite obvious that it's not working for segments of this population. And the population demographically is changing exponentially in terms of the browning of Canada. So we cannot have these things entrenched in our justice system and in policing. Similarly, in terms of the police system, we have to go back to its roots. The RCMP was created to corral and to ensure that the Indigenous people did not benefit from the lands, and that they stayed in their North American Bantustans, similar to what the South Africans created for the Black communities there, keeping them contained and chasing them around and abusing them over generations within this country. Similarly, the Ontario Provincial Police, the first real police force in Ontario, was created to corral and to make sure enslaved Black people were not too far away from their enslavers. This whole concept of carding was originated there. The identity cards were things that the police had to check, and had checked often when enslaved people were running errands or doing work for their enslavers. So it is no accident, and there's no, again, this is foundational to our police forces and the Ontario Provincial Police in particular, and all policing, that and why there's such an emotional attachment to carding as a practice, even though it has no benefit to addressing crime. It is something that has always been done. It is the basis of policing, which is to harass and to dehumanize a people in this country and keep us in our place. So we cannot expect to reform organizations that are foundationally, but were built for one thing. I have these battles in the federal public service around things like diversity and inclusion and gender-based analysis, and how those tools are supposed to be used to address anti-Black racism when they were not designed to do so. It creates challenges for people to try to revise things that were not designed to do one thing. And gender-based analysis was designed to address the issues of in the inclusion of principally white women. And they've added a plus onto that has become problematic because everybody else is in that plus. Similarly, for things like diversity and inclusion that are put in place without measures, without means of which to be able to assess your performance. In terms of the justice system, in terms of policing, we have to look at ways in which we reimagine what those institutions do, or we reimagine what public safety means in Canada. Public safety is not shaking people down. It is not monitoring. It is not surveilling, and it is not incarcerating large segments of a particular population. But we have to understand that all of these things in terms of how they were created and rooted, and what people have been saying to us and certainly for me over the last 2 years while I was in community doing some amazing work, is that the institutional racism that is within these systems and these structures, it doesn't just permeate the justice system, but it's everywhere. The UN came in 2016 to do a human rights assessment of the Black community in Canada and found that anti-Black racism permeates every institution: education, healthcare, business, and of course, the criminal justice system, or the criminalizing justice system, as some people call it, and policing. So it's not something that we can just focus on one area and in terms of trying to fix. This is a societal challenge for us that goes across institutions and across disciplines. And we see that, I'll end soon in terms of what this means in terms of COVID. As Yasser had mentioned, COVID-19 has exacerbated the societal injustices that are meted out against Black, racialized, and Indigenous people in this country. It is no accident that even though many of us raise the alarm bells that our Black communities would be disproportionately impacted by COVID, back in February, there was an institutional indifference on the part of almost all levels of government. I think the Ottawa Public Health and Rawson and your folks in the City Council did move. But in terms of the province and the federal government, there was a reticence to ignore the cries for help, that we would be decimated. And so speed forward from the spring to today, 37% of the COVID cases in Ottawa are for Black people. We make up 7% of the population, 63% in Ottawa, and racialized people when we make less than 30% of the population. So all of these things speak to sort of the glaring challenges that we have as a society. It's not just policing. Policing is the arm of the state, and they're doing what they're supposed to do. The justice system is doing what it was created to do. So if we actually really want this to be this just society that we all talk about, then we have to reimagine what that looks like. What does restorative justice look like? What does public safety look like without armed paramilitary people, bursting into people's apartments in shock and awe and having people fall down into their deaths, running from the fear of that shock and awe. And so is this the kind of society that we want to live in, where we talk about reforming institutions that were never really meant to protect us, or to keep us safe, or to met out real natural justice? So I think that maybe that's part of what should be discussed today, if there's room for it. What does a reimagined society look like with these bodies that support our citizens, both in terms of being able to support us in achieving sort of natural justice and keeping our communities safe and thriving, and not living in fear or feeling that we're being persecuted. So these thoughts are sort of synthesized in terms of my years of experience and talking to, engaging with, and philosophizing with community folks. So happy to have the opportunity to continue the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard, for that both historic and current context of the scenarios around systemic racism in our country and our province. The next speaker is Dahabo Ahmed Omar, who was the founding member of the Justice for Abdi Rahman Coalition, which advocates securing justice for the late Abdi Rahman Abdi and his family. She is a human rights specialist. She played a leadership role in the Ottawa Mayor's Task Force for Combating Anti-Black Racism and in the rollout of the Ottawa Police Services Strategy. Dahabo is currently Executive Director of the Black North Initiative, and was a lead member of Black Agenda Noir and chair of the Federation of Black Canadians. We have asked Dahabo to focus on the tragic case of the Abdirahman Abdi case and what lessons it sheds on justice and police reform in Ontario.
Thank you, Ralston. So good evening, everyone. I know that it is hard times that we're living. I know that this year has been an impeccably difficult time for most of us, if not all of us. And so I hope that this space that you're in today allows you to share your thoughts, share your perspectives. Thank you for having me, Lucille, Francis, everyone who was part of the organizing team. I think this conversation is absolutely necessary. You know, I want you to think about this as I'm speaking today, and I want you to just ask yourself why. Anytime that I give a statement or provide a commentary on anything, I want you to imagine the word why in your mind and try to answer some of these questions for yourself. And I bet you anything, it will be very difficult for you to do so. So Justice for Abdi, we're a coalition that came together very quickly after the murder of our brother Abdirahman Abdi. It was a time where we didn't know what to do. We just knew something bad happened, something that shouldn't have happened, and it happened to someone in our community. And even more so, it looked like someone, like one of us. We all saw Abdirahman in each other, whether he was a brother, a cousin, an uncle, a father, we all saw him as one of us. And so we were compelled to do something. This group came together very strongly and still remains strong because we understand that these issues are still here today. So why are they? We have done countless work, and we understood very quickly at the beginning that what happened to Abdirahman, it didn't happen in that moment. I can tell you that Abdirahman did not die on that day. He died a very long time ago. And any person in our community that is from the Black community, Indigenous community, person of color, that has died at the hands of our systems have died a long time ago. In the last 4 years, I can tell you that we've provided submissions to the Auto Police Service. We have provided submissions to the Ontario Independent Police Oversight Review with Justice Selleck. We've done it with the Anti-Racism Directorate. We've sent letters to the Government of Ontario, to the Legislative Assembly. We've developed recommendations after recommendations. We have worked tirelessly to showcase some of the gaps and challenges that exist in policing. And they're the same. Nothing that we enumerated in 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 2020 has actually changed. Why? And I want you to take a moment and just realize that we are having these conversations over and over and over again. And the trauma that comes to that is real. And I could spend time today speaking to you about what happened to Abdirahman. But I want you to realize that what happened to Abdirahman is not only an incredibly difficult trauma, but it has to do with what is happening in our education system. It has to do with what's happening in our healthcare system. It has to do with what's happening in our legal system. I have difficulties nowadays saying the justice system. I do. And I want you to ask yourself why. I think we have a process in place. I think we have a framework in place, but I wholeheartedly don't believe that we have justice in place. And so when you think about what happened to Abdirahman, I want you to think about the fact that right now, 83% of Black Canadians say that they're treated unfairly. And I want you to think about the fact that half of the non-Black community thinks that the discrimination against Black folks is no longer a problem. I want you to think about Abdirahman died, not because a police officer killed him, because we have allowed an entire system to lead to that moment where he lost his life. I want you to think about why is it that we have a reduced likelihood of Black folks and Black Canadians succeeding in job hiring processes? I want you to ask yourself, why is it that Black Canadians right now have an impaired career progression and lower levels of integration into society? I want you to think about why is it that we have an inferior access to mental health and physical health? Did you know that 29% of Black women right now do not have a family doctor? They don't have a health practitioner that knows their history, that understands their condition, that can support them, help them, and give them treatment that is conducive to them. It's 29% of our women, Black women, that don't. That could be Abdurrahman's mom. That could be me. I want you to ask yourself, how is it that we're living in a society right now that university graduated Black Canadians, on average, make 80 cents to every dollar earned by their white peers? I want you to ask yourself, why is it that the average Black worker right now makes $12,000 less than any other Canadian with the same qualifications? Abdurrahman didn't die that day. You know, discrimination in this community and in Canada generally is happening at such a menial level. We're not talking about, we know racial profiling happens. We know that over-policing happens. We know that over-representation in our prisons is at a disproportionately high rate. We know all of this. But I want you to ask yourself, why is it that right now there's racial discrimination in just resume screens? Simply, Black names, as you and I are all speaking to each other today, get 12 times fewer callbacks than white names. I don't even know what a white name or a Black name looks like. I have no idea. I want you to ask yourself why we're living in a world right now where we see no representation in our Supreme Court, zero, not a single Black person on our Supreme Court of Canada. I want you to ask yourself, how is it that we don't think about the fact that Black Canadians right now face 3 times a higher rate of diabetes, specifically Black women? Specifically Black women. And I can go on. I can go on for probably a few hours. I can tell you that 32% of cases involving police firearms are directed at Black Canadians. I can tell you that 46% of cases involving a police taser use is Black Canadians. Can you imagine being a Black Canadian and then being Abdurrahman? I want you to imagine that for a moment. For a community that continues to be impacted in ways that most of you who are not Black ever imagined for a moment. And why? Why can't we get jobs? Why can't we get proper health care? Why can't we interact with our policing institution in such a way that allows us to feel safe? And so I say all of these things to hopefully create a sense of awakening in all of you. And for you to understand that we're living in a society right now that disappoints me. And I'm sure it probably disappoints all of you. That we're living in a world where humanity is not prevalent. Where BIPOC communities can't walk down the street. They can't go get a job. They can't. And we're living in COVID times. We're living in a world where it's a global pandemic. We're in a global civil rights movement. What are we doing? Why aren't we doing anything? We keep talking, and I think we can continue talking because I think these dialogues actually create, there's over 100 people here today. I'm hoping, and this is my call to action to all of you, is at the end of this night, you say to yourself, there's something that I have to do, because I hope that Abdurrahman didn't die for nothing. I hope that the work that this coalition has done and others have done is honored through others picking up and doing more. Because the more of us that speak out against this, the easier it's gonna get, the sooner we get there. And so, I have a difficult time having these conversations. I'll be honest, my heart is always heavy. And it's because I realize that I don't I don't see as many changes as I wanted to. The conversation that I had to have with 4 of my nephews when that verdict came through was probably the most difficult conversation I've ever had in my entire life, because I could not explain why. That's all they asked me, was why, and I could not explain it. And so I'm hoping that through these conversations, through this platform, through all the work that you're all doing, that we are able to answer why, and that we're able to find a solution that doesn't allow us to have these questions in our minds anymore, and that we can honor those that have passed. So thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to the dialogue tonight.
Thank you so much for that contribution. And I know that we are having some questions come in through the chat. So at this point, we will ask our 3 first guests some questions. And I know there was a specific question to Richard surrounding whether he knows of a place where policing is done in a more equitable way.
Well, I do know that there's a model, I think it's in Utah, something called the CAHOOTS model, that allows for non-uniform, non-militarized people to go in and support people who are in mental health crisis. A lot of our people, like I often say that it's amazing that there are not more Black people that have lost their minds in this society, because we got to deal with these microaggressions and macroaggressions our entire lives. So there are a lot of people who are Black and racialized, Indigenous, who have mental health issues, and they when there's a crisis, the police are called, and bad things, tragic things, deadly things happen to the people who are calling. Sometimes our own people are calling the police because they feel that they're endangering themselves and they're killed or harmed or brutalized. So this model, this CAHOOTS model that's been running for like 30 years or something like that, they've never had a fatality. They have a very good success rate, and the costs of the so-called policing has gone down. So we've mentioned this to Chief Slowly and his folks, that there are models of policing or models of public safety, especially when dealing with people who are in mental health crisis, that does not involve a militarized response. I would also say that there's lots of examples from the Indigenous community of restorative justice and ways in which to address conflict that does not involve, again, militarization, that involves elders, that involves councils. And I think we could, as a society, move to something more like that doesn't involve like the hundreds of millions of dollars of budgetary monies that just got approved yesterday. And bravo, Ralston, for standing up for the community in your nay vote to that. But that those are models that exist, and I think that part of that is in, it's not enough to say that we're going to copy a model from somebody else. I think we really do just have to look at how to reimagine and take examples from folks who are doing things differently, Indigenous communities in this country that are doing things differently. And we're the ones that actually had the first contact with the so-called, to Dahabo's point, so-called justice system and this policing system that we have. So I like the CAHOOTS model. I think it can work, and I think it would very drastically reduce the amount of sort of monies and resources that go towards these kinds of calls, and perhaps policing could funnel some of that money to something else. I'm not necessarily someone that says we need to defund police, but we need to make sure that we have monies going towards the services that actually support our communities. And right now, that's just not happening. But Black communities don't feel like we are safe. I was on a call this summer with the city, and my son came in and said he got pulled over while I was on the call. So that, that's our lives in this society. We should not have to live in fear. I should not have to worry about whether or not my kid's going to get pulled over for driving my car. Right? So sorry for the long-winded answer, but yeah, I like Cahoots and restorative justice models from Indigenous peoples. I think is something that we need to take a hard look at in terms of public policy people looking at criminal justice and policing options.
Thank you for that, Richard. And you know, you asked an interesting question during your contribution to this conversation, and so I was thinking of you know, reposing that question to Diabo, and it's one that I'm sure she'll be able to answer quickly. What does a more ideal society look like?
Are you asking me? Sorry, it's not funny. It's just it's a long answer. I'm trying to. Are you asking me specifically around policing?
I think policing, or just generally for racialized people and Black people in Canada.
So frankly speaking, I think that the creation of a mandate, the creation of a process, the creation of the way that we interact with our community should be driven by our community. I think that the mandate of the Ottawa Police Service should remain and sit with our community. I think our community should be able to mandate what our institutions and public servants should be doing for them. And if we give that power to those of us that are in the community, that are not necessarily in these institutions, to be able to say, here's how we see you serving us specifically. I mean, we spent the other day, I mean, it was hours. There was almost 100 delegates that came to the board meeting. And you know, what I was hoping for, however the vote went, really, what I wanted to see more than anything was giving the mandate to our community to define what that looks like. I think if we can live in a society where our communities can tell us exactly what they want, and you take that and you implement that, that's how you're going to get a response where you're actually serving them. And I know it's a very overarching response, but I think that, you know, you have to have oversight from community. This is the only way that we're going to be able to build a space that's going to be conducive for our communities and that's going to ensure that we are including them. And so the voices of our community should be prevalent in any way that we build strategy, mandate, process, framework, infrastructure, structures, systems, whatever that looks like. That power should be given to the people as they have not had it for generations now.
I would definitely agree with that. I think that the principles of community engagement must be at the very heart of community safety and well-being. So thank you for that. And Yasser, I wanted to ask you a question from the audience. I know you were touching on training. This is a bit of a general question, but I think well suited for you. Eric asks, I'm wondering if there could be sensitivity training to help remove systemic racism as soon as possible in all government organizations and in the private sector as well. So I know that's a little bit open-ended, but I'll hand that question to you.
I think we need to do more than sensitivity training. I mean, one of the most important thing about Canada and the work that I'm involved in now is to build an inclusive society. And I say inclusion or inclusive to very clearly distinguish from accommodation or integration. Inclusion happens where we all learn about each other's differences, we recognize each other's differences, and we respect each other's differences and live together in celebration of those differences. And that's, if I can say, the promise of Canada. In order for that to happen, all our structures in our society, very much like this particular session right now, should be reflective of Canada, right? Diversity is a fact. You know, when we kid ourselves when we just talk about, oh, look how diverse we are. Well, that's the reality. Look at this panel. Look at this entire audience. It's extremely diverse. That's just factual. Where real action comes into play, where we have a choice and decisions to make, is how do we turn that diversity into an inclusive environment, whether it's our workplace, whether it's our police service, whether it's our judiciary, whether it's government or not-for-profit or the private sector, is when we make it reflective of who we are as a society. Hope is the chances are that we will make decisions based on our upbringing, our cultural norms and values that we've been taught that will benefit everyone. And I think one of the biggest systemic barriers that we've seen, and it's true still in Canada, that we're truly not an inclusive society, right? We still are not reflective. You know, we're overrepresented when it comes to, for example, as Richard mentioned, that the study came out with diseases like COVID-19, but we're underrepresented when it comes to being police officers, being judges, being CEOs, being members of parliament or city councilors, right? That's, you can clearly see, it's not rocket science, you can clearly see where the disproportionality is taking place. So I would say to you that it's not sensitivity training we need. It's what we really need is to make sure that everyone is getting an opportunity to be part of the process, to be part of decision making, whether that's in government or outside.
Thank you for that, Yasser. And thank you for your questions as we move on to our next speaker, who will address the issue of systemic racism in police and justice reform from an Indigenous perspective. Mark Miracle is Mohawk and has been involved with First Nations and Indigenous issues throughout his 37-year professional career. He has worked as a policy advisor with the federal government and as a private consultant. He is now executive director of Gugnell Nonprofit Housing Corporation. Mark also co-chairs the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition and the Urban Indigenous Strategy, which has been engaged in a dialogue with Ottawa Police Services on establishing a new relationship with Indigenous communities, one that is based on mutual respect. We've asked Mark to talk about this dialogue and what the Indigenous recommendations for anti-racist police services in Ottawa means. So now I'll invite Mark to say his words.
Thank you, Rolson. And thanks to the organizers for tonight's forum. And I'd also like to acknowledge the opportunity to share an Indigenous perspective on racism and an emerging relationship with the Ottawa Police Services. And certainly from an Indigenous perspective, there is no doubt that systemic racism exists in the criminal justice system and certainly within police services across Canada. The question is, how do we, that being you and me, intend to address that? How are we going to make real change? And if history has taught us anything, it's that we cannot make change in isolation. And I think the notion is reinforced by tonight's theme, making positive change together. We can make change by recognizing each other, by listening to each other, and better understanding our unique perspectives and understandings, and an ability to suspend judgment. The coalition that I'm a part of do a lot of our work through relationship building. And an elder, Jim Albert, told us at the onset of the creation of our coalition in 2001 that everything we do is about relationships and relationships to one another. And certainly our work has been orientated through a relationship continuum. And it starts with awareness and education. And it truly is based on integrity and respect for each other. And it's about building trust. And over time, developing the confidence in one another that eventually you'll get to a point where you talk about shared risk, where both parties have skin in the game. And against a backdrop of time, because establishing a relationship, it could take 2 hours, it could take 2 days, it could take 2 years. But the notion is we're investing in each other and you do whatever it takes to make that relationship work. And for the coalition, a lot of what we've focused our work around in terms of deepening relationships is doing some of that work through listening circles. And I'll get to a little bit more of that later on. But we're using listening circles as a ways and means to build better relationships through dialogue and small group discussion. And for the coalition, we have oriented our work through relationship streams. So over the 20-year history of our coalition, we have developed specific relationships with the City of Ottawa and created Aboriginal Working Committee. And currently our work is very much focused around COVID and its impacts in the community. We also have a relationship stream with the United Way that initially focused on Indigenous agency support, but that quickly built into capacity building and finding an Indigenous voice within an organization like the United Way, to the point now where we're actually invited to identify representation from the Indigenous community on their board of directors. And currently we've established an employment leadership table, a financial literacy training, and additional work around COVID. But we have relationship streams with the federal government through an urban Indigenous strategy, with the provincial government through the Indigenous Affairs Ontario, with school boards in Ottawa, with the Ottawa Carleton District School Board specifically, and the Catholic School Board. We have a regular, very rich relationship with Ottawa Public Health, and an emerging relationship with the Royal Ottawa Hospital around mental health and research. And a current focus is with the Ottawa Police Services. Now with that, the Wabeno Center for Aboriginal Health initiated a letter to Chief Slowly in the summertime of this past summer, and the coalition itself has endorsed 5 recommendations in terms of this potential relationship with the police. And we were seeking to partner with, or seeking to have the Ottawa Police Services partner more fully with service providers for wellness checks, and to undertake recruitment based on gender and race, also to identify patterns of undue harm and to be able to make real change. Another recommendation was around the development of plans based on Indigenous consultations in Ottawa, and a 5th recommendation around the creation of a comprehensive Indigenous anti-racism training strategy. And the coalition itself had actually followed up in September, again with a separate letter to Chief Slowly, and indicated our intention to follow up on the SIU report that was issued on the death of Greg Ritchie, that we had made arrangements to meet with them in the spring, but due to COVID that got postponed. And also to talk more closely with the police about the work that we're doing with the Royal Ottawa Hospital, and to create a mental health team that's Indigenous focused and Indigenous resource, but really to be first in, and have the police support as opposed to lead in cases of mental health. We were also asking Ottawa Police Services to track successful de-escalation cases so that we could use that as lessons learned, as well as close contact with the Community Equity Council in terms of supporting our approach through listening circles. And also to indicate to Ottawa Police Services that we do support the creation of neighborhood resource teams, and to create better relationships and dialogue and connecting points to those resource teams. And we were also asking Ottawa Police Services to provide a response in terms of their response to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report. So in addition to all of that, the coalition has been very much focused on supporting Indigenous recruitment within the OPS that would also include retention and promotion but we really want to invest in the success of Indigenous officers and also to promote the need for a regular schedule of meetings with our elders as well as with the coalition, with Chief Slowly, as well as his senior executive team. And we've really picked up a lot of speed in terms of communications. We've met specifically with Chief Slowly and his senior executive team in September. We've also met with Councillor Dean and Chief Slowly in October. And Chief Slowly actually attended a meeting of our Circle of Elders at the end of September. And we initiated a fairly lengthy meeting in early November with the senior executive team of OPS. And within the next week or so, we will be scheduling another meeting with OPS to advance an agenda of co-development and cooperation. And we will be picking up specifically on the mental health option and leading that discussion in the creation of an Indigenous ACT team. So I'd like to kind of pick up on the listening circles, and we've actually convened the first listening circle with the Inuit community that took place in early November. And it was limited due to COVID, but there were 25 invited community members, and the full member of the Ottawa Police Services senior executive team were in attendance. Chief Slowly, his 2 deputy chiefs, and 5 superintendents attended that meeting. We've got over 40,000 Indigenous people in Ottawa, and within that population, there are over 3,000 Inuit people, and it's the largest Inuit community outside of the North. And I think it's safe to say right now that there is a crisis in the Inuit community in terms of a high number of recent deaths within the community itself. They're facing very significant mental health issues due to cultural displacement, as well as the impacts of COVID and poverty. Homelessness is far too prevalent in the Inuit community, as well as the Indigenous community overall. A lot of them face housing instability. We've got an overabundance of violence against women, violence against Inuit men, child abuse, and there is a certain amount of trauma that the Inuit community is experiencing, even in dealing with COVID in the North and their home communities. And the North is locked down right now, and they're seeing an exponential growth of cases of COVID. So along with cultural displacement and disconnection, Inuit people in this city genuinely feel that they don't fit in. And from a cultural perspective, they're often lumped in with other Indigenous peoples. There's discrimination that they face from mainstream, but also from other Indigenous peoples. And current service models simply do not address their needs. So when we talk about access to programs and services, when they're released from hospital, when they come down for education from the North, a lot of them are relocated to group homes. There really is a disconnect in the actual programs and services that are supposed to be there to serve their needs. That is complete gap and a miss. So there is an intention on the part of the Inuit community. The first listening circle that was conducted in early November was sponsored by Inukatigi, which is an Inuit Head Start site. And in January, there's an intention to convene another Inuit listening circle that's being coordinated by Tungasuvia Inuit, which is for all intensive purposes like almost like a friendship center for Inuit here in the city. And the coalition itself, we had been planning a larger community listening circle, but COVID brought a stop to that. So once we get past COVID, there is an intention to conduct a broader community listening circle, invite OPS to attend, and hear firsthand from community members, organizations, youth, specifically about the relationship and how do we make real change. So I think I'll turn it back to you, Ralston. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for providing the Indigenous perspective and also for talking about the extensive and exhaustive work that your organization is doing. It's quite incredible to hear. We'll now move on to our fifth panelist, and we will be hearing from Parnika Raj, who is from Ottawa and is a fourth-year media production student at Ryerson University. Parnika started a petition to make a race and ethnicity course mandatory in secondary schools in Ontario. The petition has amassed 75,000 signatures and has spread to other provinces. Parnika is working with MPP Collard on a private member's bill to make learning about race and ethnicity a mandatory part of the education curriculum in Ontario schools. We want to know what motivated Parnika to come up with this initiative and why she thinks it can make a difference.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well at home amidst the pandemic and taking care of themselves. I'd like to start by thanking Lucille, Francis, and King for organizing this and having me tonight. I'm really thankful to be speaking on this. As mentioned before, I made a petition to make race ethnicity a mandatory class in high school. And what inspired me is I took this course in university, and I just was astounded about how much I didn't know growing up in Ottawa in high school, and how it just opened my eyes to the treatment of Black and Indigenous people in Canada and other POCs. And I just didn't know that knowledge growing up. So I basically created this petition to kind of bring that knowledge to a high school level, and even it should be even distributed to lower levels of education, just kind of like an overall change of like the attitudes. Because currently our like primary and secondary education system does not address what happened in the past with treatment of Indigenous people and slavery. It addresses it, but not in the way that is applicable to today. It's kind of like it happened in the past, it was bad, but now we're better. But we're still facing the lasting like effects of colonialism, and we should address those systems. And yeah, so some topics I would cover in the course would be how BIPOCs are portrayed in media, how are they like recipients of healthcare, treated by like the education system, the treatment at like the workplace, including hiring practices, and how are they dealt with by the justice system, the Eurocentric beauty standard, the racialization of poverty, racism and reconciliation with Indigenous people, white privilege, white fragility, and microaggressions. During like the Black Lives Matter movement that happened in the summer in June, I saw like an explosion of like, for my generation, Instagram and social media is very prevalent. So an explosion of kind of like infographics and texts explaining a lot of the things I would like to cover in the course. But for some people, I know this is the first time they're seeing these words and these kind of like lessons, and I feel like they wouldn't take it as seriously if they're seeing it on social media versus if they were taught it in school. So I just want to bring all this education to like a standard like public school system, so like everyone can be exposed to it, and as they're growing up, their views are, they're given more perspective and their views are better on, just overall more educated around the people in their society. Yeah, I just having this having this course, I think would really benefit, because it would just I think we're still fighting on a lot of topics today, like fighting if they're, I'm trying to find the right word, if they're correct or not, or if they exist or not. And I think just having the right education will just allow more people to be on the same playing level and understanding of race in society.
Thank you so much for that answer to a question. I think you actually answered a question that we had that came in somebody said, we believe that inclusive education that meets the needs of all students has a positive impact in promoting diversity and inclusivity. When is the government going to include Black and Indigenous history and culture into the curriculum? And you are working on that. And that's amazing. I wish I had that experience in terms of lawmaking when I was in my undergrad, having the capacity to do that. So hats off to you. It's really, really impressive. Our final speaker is Lawrence Greenspan, who is a well-known human rights lawyer in Ottawa. Lawrence is senior partner with the law firm of Greenspan Granger Hill and has been a champion for the rights of minorities since the early 1980s when he was a member of the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Visible Minorities. Lawrence has taken on many difficult human rights cases, most recently as an advocate for the Abdi family. Because of his practical experience as a lawyer defending members of the racialized community, we've asked Lawrence to tell us what reforms need to be made to root out systemic racism in our police and justice system. Once Lawrence has completed his remarks, I will ask the other members of the panel to add their thoughts before inviting members of the audience to weigh in with questions and comments. So I'll turn it over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you very much, Ralston, and to MPP Collard and her staff for arranging this. And I have been representing people and suing the police for over 40 years for false arrest, excess force, negligent investigation, false imprisonment, malicious prosecution, intentional interference with economic relations, violation of charter rights, and wrongful death. I'm currently representing the Abdi family, the Ritchie family, the Ifedi family, and the Oust family, to name just a few of the ongoing cases in which we are fighting back. In over 4 decades, on an almost daily basis, it's been important to keep this serenity prayer at top of mind. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And while I am rarely serene in accepting the things I cannot change, I have found strength and support from the community whose members have been treated unjustly. I want to speak with you about 3 areas. The first, where I don't believe change can take place, and the latter 2, where change is necessary and can be achieved. In terms of criminal proceedings, and I'll deal with that, police complaints, disciplinary matters, and constitutional violations. When we come to criminal proceedings, it starts with, against police officers, it starts with the SIU. And there's some notion out there that the SIU should be able to compel police officers, subject officers, to provide notes and investigative action reports. The whole idea behind not compelling either written or verbal statements from anyone is that if you compel a statement from somebody, it's not going to be reliable. Quite apart from the lack of reliability of police officers, subject officers who are involved in serious matters involving the SIU, quite apart from the absence of reliability of compelling their production of their notes or their statements, is there's something called the right not to self-incriminate. And that right belongs to all of us. It's a right that's in our Constitution, and it's what protects anyone from having to give evidence against themselves. The power of suspension that has been advocated for pending criminal proceedings is, again, it may be something that the people want to see happen. They want to see somebody, a police officer who's charged with a serious crime. They want to see that officer suspended and without pay, pending. What does that say about our presumption of innocence in Canada? Why is it that everyone else in this country, if charged with a criminal offense, they don't lose their job automatically and without pay? Why would we do that to police officers? Why would we set up a system in which they are treated worse than anyone else? So keep in mind those principles when we talk about these changes that are being advocated for. That said, in the police complaint process, in the disciplinary process, there is a power to suspend. There can be suspension pending the resolution of disciplinary matters against police officers. So go for it. If there's a disciplinary matter, if there's a Police Service Act charges that have been laid against the police officer, there is the power to suspend. That's the power to suspend that should be utilized. There is a problem with the current burden of proof against police officers, and many of you are probably not aware of it. But if any profession, any occupation goes to disciplinary proceedings in this province, the charges have to be made out simply on a balance of probabilities. Balance of probabilities means 51-49, more likely than not, except for police. Police have, by virtue of a decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal, case called Krupa versus Jacobs, was an Ottawa police officer. By virtue of that decision, police somehow are entitled to a higher burden of proof. What that means is, if you want to make out a misconduct against a police officer, it has to be on clear and convincing evidence. And that's a higher standard than balance of probabilities. Why is it that we have this higher standard of proof required for police officers? And the answer to that is we shouldn't. And that is something that can be changed in Queen's Park. There's this burden of proof that exists only for police officers is something, as I say, that can be changed in Queen's Park by our members of the legislature. And it's something that I hope they would put forward as the police are certainly not entitled to any higher standard of proof before they're subject to discipline. Something that as well, in terms of police complaints, there's nothing in it for the complainant. Let's stop kidding ourselves. There's a reason why there's 1% to 2% of all complaints actually make it through to a hearing, and there's a resulting successful discipline against the police. The fact is there's nothing in it for the complainant. There's no money. There's no incentive. There's absolutely no reason for them to bring forward a public complaint. And in the cases where public complaints are successful, there's nothing at the end of the rainbow for that complainant. Police officer might be disciplined. They might lose a week's pay or 2 weeks' pay. In a serious case, they might be demoted from first class to second class for a year, something of that nature. What does that give to the complainant? I spoke to the Justice Lesage, who was going around the province, and I said, you're looking at changing the police complaint system? Put something in there for the people that are complaining. That's also something that can be done and should be done at Queen's Park. Lastly, constitutional violations. I want you to understand that every single day, criminal defense lawyers are going to court, and we are arguing that police officers are violating the charter rights of various people. They're using excess force, they're denying right to counsel, they're arbitrarily detaining, they're improperly searching and seizing people, and they are breaking the Charter of Rights, our Constitution. Do you know that there is no system in place to even record when a judge finds that a police officer has violated the constitutional rights of somebody? There's no system in place to even let the officer himself know that that has happened. There's no system in place to certainly let the Police Services Board know, no system in place to let the police chief know. In fact, I cross-examined a police officer about 10 days ago, and I established with him that he had testified in about 50 cases in which Charter of Rights issues had been forward. He had never, ever been informed of the result of those applications, those charter applications. So we have police officers who are violating the rights of individuals on a daily basis, being found by judges, and there's nothing done. Absolutely nothing done. Robert Kennedy said, "We know that it is law which enables people to live together, that creates order out of chaos. We know that law is the glue that holds civilization together. And we know that if one person's rights are denied, then the rights of all are endangered." These are changes that can and should be made to our existing law in Ontario and throughout Canada. I can tell you that the absence of a system to even record constitutional violations found by judges is something that it's not just Ottawa, it's across the province. I suspect it's right across the country. Until we have a system in place where we actually do something to police officers who violate constitutional rights, until we have some kind of system in place, whether it's training, whether it's punishment, whether it's something, some form of remediation, until that gets put into place, police officers are going to continue to break the laws with impunity. They know, the bad ones know, they have to know that they're not going to be held accountable. So when we talk about police accountability, it's very nice to talk about it, but the reality is that the one officer out of many who is going to do something wrong, going to misconduct themselves, going to treat a member of our communities in an improper way, in an unconstitutional way, or in an illegal way, they know in the back of their minds, sometimes even in the front of their minds, they know they can get away with it. And these changes that I'm proposing are designed to try and stop this pervasive thinking on the part of the officers who will break the law and treat people wrongly and unfairly and illegally. These are proposals that I put forward. I hope, Madam Collard, that you will be kind enough to take them forward to Queen's Park. And subject to any questions or comments that people have, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to make these points.
Well, thank you, Lawrence, for your observations concerning our legal system. And also thank you to all of our esteemed panelists who have contributed their statements tonight. What I would like to do is invite our panelists to respond to Lawrence's remarks about what needs to be done in terms of police and justice reform. And obviously, this is an open question. You can draw upon specifics from Lawrence's statement, but we want to hear from you.
Well, Ralston, from my perspective, certainly the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition had every intention of following up with SIU on the report that they issued on the death of Mr. Ritchie. And it certainly struck us. We've seen a draft copy of the report before they released it. And I mean, it was completely tone deaf in terms of its reference to culture and understanding Mr. Ritchie's background. And I just find it, I don't understand why a police officer wouldn't be subject to providing notes and reports and subject to some form of interview when you have someone die. I mean, there is no recourse or closure for the family. The timeframes involved were abusive to the Ritchie family specifically, and to the Indigenous community in Ottawa that once again seen confrontation with the police that resulted in death, and the perception that there really is no accountability one way or another. So it was frustrating for sure. And at some point, I believe that we will be following up with SIU, making arrangements to meet with the head again and raise these concerns directly.
Mark, if I may, you're right. The SIU report was painfully thin. completely ignorant of the fact that he was apparently carrying a ceremonial tomahawk. They had it as a knife and a weapon. The Ritchie case, as well as the Abdi case, I think underline the real problem which exists with the Ottawa Police Service, and that is that they have no idea. They have no idea how to identify, how to de-escalate when it comes to dealing with a person who has mental health issues. They are virtually clued out, and even more so when, as in the Ritchie case, there are clear matters of the person's background and culture which are involved, coupled with mental health issues. The two police officers that were on the scene were completely unequipped with anything except use of force options as to how to deal with him that day. And it's the subject of a civil action, which we have started. And there's also, at this point in time, I can tell you that there's consideration being given to calling a coroner's inquest to look into to some of the systemic issues dealing with mental health issues, and how to properly appreciate persons of Aboriginal background when they're being approached by the Ottawa Police.
I just wanted to come in and of course appreciate Lawrence's extensive courtroom experience to this, because I think it gives a real practical aspect to the conversation we are having. Lawrence, as I recall, the changes that we brought to the oversight in 2018, we did change the burden of proof to balance of probability. However, I think those changes got reversed when the new government came into office, and they went back to the ones you mentioned, because I remember some very heated conversations with policing stakeholders on that issue.
And that's a big change. Yes, sir. I appreciate that the effort was made to bring it back to where it should be with balance of probabilities. And people, we're not just talking legalities here. This is not some legal discussion between lawyers that we're having. What we're talking about is, in Ontario, police officers who have been charged with misconduct. Unlike any other profession or occupation, you have to show proof at a higher level than anyone else. And that's what, Yasser, what one of the things you were trying to change, and sorry to interrupt you there, but it's a very, very significant issue.
So for Lucille, it should be a very easy cut and paste job from the 2018 legislation, with perhaps hopefully with community input improvements to it. You did pick my curiosity on the last point you made that I was not aware of, about recording of constitutional violations. Would that not happen by virtue of case law? I mean, if a judge is declaring or making an order based on a constitutional violation, would that not be part of public record?
It's part of the public record. If the citizen picks it up, then you'll hear about the case. But 99 times out of 100, the citizen doesn't pick it up, and the police officers come and they give in their testimony, and then they leave. And several weeks later, a judge makes a decision. And in that decision, the judge finds that that officer violated constitutional rights. And as a result, the charges against the accused are being thrown out. That decision rarely gets reported by the citizen. It rarely is ever reduced to a transcript and even filed with CanLII or any of the other legal reporting services. And I've discussed this with Chief Slowly. I've said to him, look, you don't even have a system in place. And the decision we had last week from Judge Dumel was just that. She said that one of the reasons that she was throwing the evidence out was because the officer, when I cross-examined him, testified that there's no system in place to even record, let alone get back to the police officer and his superiors. There's no system in place to even do anything with a judgment from the court finding that this officer has violated constitutional rights. It's absolutely, I I shouldn't apologize for being worked up about it, because it's something that I've been stressing. It's now at the point where some of the judges that I've spoken to, at the end of their judgment, they make a point of telling the Crown, I want to make sure that the police officer involved here, who's breached constitutional rights, I want to make sure that that officer is informed. So the judges are actually now starting to work it into part of their judgment, because there's no system.
If I may weigh in, you know, we're talking about misconduct. We're talking about consequences and things that need to be in place in order for police officers to understand that if they do something wrong, something will happen to ensure that they are held accountable. And one of the big pieces for me, and it's been a huge recommendation that has come out of some of the work that we've done at the coalition, is that we already know that there are issues with the framework of the Special Investigations Unit. That we already know. But if we even go further and say, okay, let's just say that we can trust the SIU to do what they need to do. Right now, a non-compliance to SIU doesn't amount to any serious misconduct. So let's just say that, and again, I'm trying not to go into sort of the legalese. I'm not a lawyer in any way. But some of the research that we've done is that the Police Service Act right now requires all police officers to cooperate with SIU. But if they don't, if they choose not to, there's no effective enforcement mechanisms. There isn't. And one of the, so if we're talking about recommendations, I think it's important for our enforcement mechanisms to just sort of facilitate a greater compliance with investigations and uphold sort of that integrity of the oversight body that's there right now. I understand that we may take some time in sort of having that systemic change, but if we ensure that the provincial legislature can draft a legislation or a regulation which ensures and that if any failure to cooperate or any obstruction to an investigation would lead to serious consequences. Right now, there isn't. A police officer can be a witness to, you know, an incident, an interaction, and walk away scot-free. Mm-hmm. Walk away and never provide any information. That means not furnishing any notes, not providing any testimonies, not showing up for interviews. I mean, we've seen police officers do this. Mm-hmm. And so how do we now, we have an investigative body that's supposed to implement these enforcement mechanisms that isn't doing it. Then we have police officers who are engaging in misconduct. And then we have police officers who are witnessing this misconduct and won't testify or won't provide any testimony again. I mean, the entire thing is broken.
Yeah, you have to distinguish, certainly I take your point, but you have to distinguish between subject officers, and subject officers are like suspects or accused. Yeah. They don't have any legal responsibility to provide notes and provide statements and everything like that. As soon as they're deemed a subject officer, they clam up. And quite frankly, I don't think that that should change because of the right to not to self-incriminate, and because anything that they say is going to be not reliable anyway. But as far as the other officers are concerned, witness officers, they do have a duty, as you point out, they do have a duty to cooperate, and they should be cooperating. And if they don't, then there should be consequences. Absolutely.
And at this point, I don't know if Richard has any comments to make.
I do, actually.
Excellent.
I do. I guess the only thing that I would say is that, sorry, multiple devices going at the same time. I guess the only thing that what I would say is that what Lawrence has sort of articulated in terms of what needs to be done, Yasser in terms of the work that had been done, you know, JFA through Dahabo and then other groups that need to be done. In order to actually make it happen, what I think is that we need sort of a public groundswell of support and action at the political level. And I know that there was a comment here about the white people on the line here. I think that white people, those who are newly woke to this sort of new civil rights movement, if you want to call it that, and other allies, along with Indigenous and other people, should really be politicizing the kind of changes that we need to have made within this society. You know, I don't think it's rocket science. I think that many of these changes are packaged up, and I think that people should be actually preparing themselves as communities and as leaders and as everyday folk to make these ballot box issues. Otherwise, we will not see change. And I think that was one of the things I heard on the radio this morning. My brother Robin was on CBC talking about the vote yesterday against the people, as far as many of us are concerned in terms of the police budget. Although we support Chief Slowly and the reforms he's trying to do, we support more black cops and so on. But we do not support the militarization, the continued militarization of our police. We do not support justice system that is really unjust. The Abdi case, or sorry, the Monsignor case really left a really terrible bloody stain on Ottawa, despite what the mayor and others were saying about, you know, having to respect the judgment. None of us in our communities believe that justice was served. So if it's not just us as Black, Indigenous, and racialized people who are feeling that we're not being served by either the police or by the justice system, then it's incumbent on all of you to actually do something about it and to organize and to support and to ally with people who want to make that change. And, you know, like down in the South, they got rid of the guy who didn't really support the people, was really what you would call a lightning rod for racial division and hate. Got rid of him. And I think, you know, when we think about the kind of power that the electorate have, and then the people who are on this call and others in the community, we actually can force a lot of change on systems, municipal, provincial, and federal. But I think we don't realize, because Canadians oftentimes are so polite about most of what we do, we don't realize how much power we really have. It's not me or people like me that are driving the change. It has to be driven, like we're articulating what needs to be done. We're articulating the pain and the trauma of living and in some cases being oppressed by these systems. But it's the conscience of Canada, the city of Ottawa, the province, that we need to sort of draw on for the kind of change. And if people are really wanting to do something about it, then I think, you know, step up and make this a ballot box issue. And I think there are ways in which we can work with our brothers and sisters in the streets and in the boardrooms and in the community centers, and to make that happen. That's just my opinion. Otherwise, we continue having these conversations of what needs to be done, but the armies of people that need to make it happen are you and us, actually.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to know if Parnika wanted to contribute as well.
I mean, I would just echo the same points. I think education for me is the strongest point, and at younger ages, the more impactful education is. Obviously having kind of like the anti-racism and anti-oppression courses in workplaces does also help, but I feel like not everyone is receptive to those later on in like a workplace. Like I feel like instilling it at a younger age would be better. But yeah.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your contributions here. We will be moving on to some of the questions from the audience. They've been coming in fast and furiously, so I do want to get to them. But before I do want to recognize some of the learned leaders and others who have joined us. You know, everybody who is contributing is equally important. But we do want to recognize some of our community members, including Reverend Dr. Anthony Bailey of the Parkdale United Church, Ewart Walters, who had registered for this event, Councillor Tim Turney, who also had registered for this event, and also my fellow colleagues. I was recently appointed to Police Services Board just a scant 4 or 5 weeks ago. And so I want to acknowledge their presence in the room. That includes Vice Chair Sandy Smallwood, Daljeet Nirman, and Bev Johnson. So thank you for joining us today, and everybody else. And I really do want to get to some of the questions that we have. One that we have is from Farnaz, and it is, why not look into alternative forms of justice like transformative justice and healing justice practices? And I've opened the floor.
Maybe we can we ask Farnaz to give us 30 seconds on what he says is transformative justice? And the second part of the question, I think, might be best directed at Mark Maracle, but I'd be interested in Farnaz's brief description of what transformative justice is. That might be of some help to everybody, including me.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, she. Yeah, so transformative justice is a framework of justice that's moving beyond the carceral system and penal system. So it would be looking in addressing the violence and harm in our community in a collective way that's centering the needs of people who have been harmed and also those who have done the harming, because it's rooted in this idea that people who harm have also experienced harm at one point. But it is moving away from policing, prisons, and just kind of any carceral system and those types of toxic power dynamics. And it is centered around healing, and the two kind of go together. And I did also include a link to a website in the chat, and that kind of has different situations in which transformative justice has been used. So whether it's sexual violence, whether it's domestic violence, it's all very different. And the key to it is that it's not going to be a magical solution in the way that like, this is the magic answer on a golden plate, because it recognizes that each conflict has its own distinct characteristics and needs that are like specific to that conflict and the people within them. But that site is a good place to start for people who are curious about it. But there's also other books and organizations who practice it, although it is a more difficult way of approaching these harms, but it's a more practical way and a more necessary way. It's not putting away someone in a human cage and expecting a good result from it. It's actually addressing these harms head on. So that's just a little brief explanation.
Thank you very much, Farnaz. That's helpful. And the only example that I can see that I'm aware of in Ottawa is the Collaborative Justice Project. And unfortunately, that Collaborative Justice Project is limited to what I would say are minor crimes. They're property crimes. It doesn't lend itself and doesn't end up getting involved in domestic assault or sexual assault. So that approach, the one that you're talking about, would be wonderful if collaborative justice was expanded and their mandate was expanded. The other thing that would be nice is if they could stop doing bake sales in order to be able to pay the overhead, because they're constantly in needs of funding, despite the fact that they save the administration of justice system hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars by diverting cases, taking them through the collaborative justice program. Despite that, the Ontario government refuses to fund them in any reasonable way that would allow them to really continue their good work.
If I can maybe comment, I've known, and thank you, Farnaz. So it's you know it's a form of justice that allows sort of love and empathy and compassion to be at the forefront. It's not about punishment. I think we live in a society that is not ready for that. I don't think we're ready to be in a place where we can look at what a path to redemption looks like through that lens. It's a concept that allows us to not look at someone as a criminal, but more so as someone who has fallen, and that we can now support and find a way to ensure that they can rise. I think that there are there are communities and certain families that actually have spoken about this. And what does accountability look like? Does it look like remorse? Does it look like an understanding that what happened or what you've done is wrong? And there's a bigger sort of, it is more difficult. But you know what? I don't know, and maybe Lawrence or Yasser or other folks in this conversation can tell me who said that someone who commits this type of crime is supposed to go to jail for 10 years as opposed to another crime, it's 15 years and another one is 20 years. Like, how did we come up with this framework? How did we do that? I don't know. I have no idea if someone who, if it was a breaking and entering and that person gets 5 years, and someone who, I don't understand the framework. I don't know how it was built. I don't understand the foundation. And it goes back to those deep rooted issues that it was always about locking away and getting rid of the problem instead of addressing the problem. And so that transformative process really allows us to actually put more time in, more understanding in, and it allows our systems to actually work in a functional way. Now, I say this, and I'm thinking about some sessions that I've attended in the past of families who've actually have spoken about this and what that would look like for them, and they have been the victim. And it looks very different, but it's very much all rooted in love, and it's very rooted in compassion. How do we now transform this individual to become a better person? Because something happened. I think that you have to believe to some capacity that we're all good people. In our roots are good. We are good people. We weren't born to be bad. We weren't born evil. Things have happened over the course of people's lives to sort of have certain things happen. And I say that with all of the privilege in the world, and I recognize that I'm not a victim of that type of those types of crimes. But I'm always wondering who made the decision of what the consequences look like, and what did they think about? How was that formula how did they come up with that type of formula? Who gets 5 years and who gets 25? And how do we know if the individuals that gets 5 years actually deserves that 5 years, or there's redemption, or there's positive like, we know that when people come out of these systems, they're far worse than when they went in. We know this, there's been enough research on this, but I'm really wondering, and this is very much a maybe a naive question, but it's a very honest question. Who decided that? Who decided how many years people get? What the consequences look like? I don't know, but I think transformative justice is something we are absolutely not ready for, to be frank.
I know you were talking about specific timeframes, and we do have a question from Mira. An 18-year-old adult convicted of drug trafficking has served his sentence. Once released from prison, has a criminal record and can only ask for a pardon after 10 years. He cannot work in a school or in the public service. Is it possible to change this 10-year period, and what can be done to ensure better reintegration? And once again, that's an open question to the panelists.
I'm surprised to hear 10 years. My impression was that it was 5 years on an indictable offense. But even so, an 18-year-old with a criminal record that can't be pardoned for 5 years is looking at a very serious uphill battle to try and get meaningful employment. Can it be changed? Almost coming back to Dahabo's question, which is how does that get decided? Well, it gets decided by judges. And we've just finished successfully attacking over the last 2-3 years. I'm going to throw out a number of about 100 mandatory minimum sentences that were put in place by the Harper government. Those mandatory minimum sentences were all attacked successfully constitutionally because they took the discretion out of the hands of the judge to impose a sentence which not only fits the crime, but fits the offender. So to come back to this question, putting the period of time during which a person has to wait for pardons, putting that in the hands of a judge or somebody who works with that young person would be a far better system than saying, look, that's it, indictable offense, you can't apply for a pardon for 5 years or 10 years, as the case may be. It's a matter of putting it back into the hands of human beings rather than setting out a hard and fast rule, 5 years, no pardon, or 10 years, no pardon. If you're convicted of such and such an offense, the mandatory minimum sentence is 5-year penalty. I mean, it's outrageous. I mean, why would we have judges? Why would we have judges who are sitting there trying to match the sentence to the offender and to the crime and to their background and to their community and how they've been brought up and everything they've been through when there's a mandatory minimum? It makes no sense. And that's why those mandatory minimum sentences were struck down constitutionally over the last 2, 3, 4 years. They've all been successfully cut down because they don't take into account the humanity of what's supposed to be in the sentencing process.
And can I?
Go ahead, Dabo.
I'm sorry, Yasser. I've spoken.
We got to talk, Dabo. We got to talk.
Yeah, we have to, because you
have all these questions.
No, and you know what? I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing all of you, and above and beyond all of this, I'm wondering, how do we now apply the race relations lens? How do we now do that with the entire court system? How does a judge look at a young Black man and say to themselves, I'm going to now consider the historical context, the challenges that they face, discriminatory practices that they probably have come face to face. How am I now going to look at this person as a fulsome human being? How am I going to look at their culture? I mean, there's no, race relations doesn't exist in law. It doesn't. For those of you that are lawyers, you know this.
Well,
so don't tell me.
It's in place. It's in place for the Aboriginal people.
It is, but we know.
So what you're talking about is the same kind of thing for people of color. And
absolutely, I am. And for those of you that are on this line, and I'm sure most of you know this, but if you don't, I urge you to go look at the International Decade for People of African Descent. The United Nations went across the world. This is a global research that's been done on the state of affairs for Blacks in all sorts of places around the world. And they've identified Blacks as a distinct community who should have, from justice to development. I mean, there's so many pieces that they've looked at, but we have been identified as a distinct community. How is it that we can't look at Black communities as a community that is not facing the world and society in the same way? Therefore, the way that the legal system impacts them should be absolutely and incredibly different, and it isn't right now. And then on top of that, to top that all off, we have no Black judges, barely any, who can at least bring that experience and bring that lived experience, but also understanding. There isn't. So then what do? We're stuck. We're literally stuck. I'm being honest, and it hurts because I'm saying to myself, we have all of these individuals going into the legal system, and there isn't a place that allows them to be looked at differently, not only because they're different, but because it's fair, it's transparent, it's honest, it's real, that Black communities are not the same as other communities. And if you think otherwise, then you're missing the mark, right? And then they go into these jail, into these prisons, and they get incarcerated, and then they come out. And I'm working with Corrections Canada right now on a project, and we're working with people that are newly released, or people that have been released for the last 5 or 10 years. And I'm telling you, they'll tell you, I'd rather be back. I'd rather be back because this is worse. I'm free, but I'm not free. So you are putting this in, you're putting a sentence on this individual, and it may look like 5 years, but I can tell you that it's a life sentence to most of these individuals, because getting housing is incredibly difficult. Going back to school is incredibly difficult. Forget getting a job. And then how do you survive? right? And they say, they'll say, and I've spoken to one young man who really broke my heart and said, Tahaba, I'd rather be back, because then I knew I had a meal. I knew I was gonna eat, and I knew where I was gonna sleep. Can you imagine people wanting to go back because it gives them a sense of living, even in jail?
Yeah, but now's the time. Now is the time. No, just give me a moment. Now is the time, because it's already been broken through. It's already part of the criminal code that judges have to consider the historical treatment of Aboriginal people in our country. They have to consider that before they impose sentence. They have to do that. The precedent has already been set. What you're talking about can be done, and it should be done. And now, right now, when the issue is front and center all across the world, now's the time to make those changes, so that it's required that a judge take into account the background of the individual, the cultural differences, all of the things that you've talked about. Now's the time to make those kind of changes to the legislation. But that's federal, okay? Those are federal changes.
And so I will make my point now, because it fits in, because the criminal code is not a book that comes out of thin air. It's an act of parliament. And people who we elect make those changes. So to going back to Richard's point earlier, we have to vote. We have to participate. We have to ask questions when politicians come to our doors and ask for a vote. We should run for office if we don't like the change that is being made. I mean, the change is within our grasp. Been there, done that, right? And we need to take that seriously. If our voter turnout remains 60-65%, which is also a systemic issue, by the way, because people, Black, Indigenous people, people of color, don't go out and vote because they don't see themselves reflected in the system, because they think their voices are not being heard. But if we get them out in larger numbers on the ballot, at the polling stations, things will change. And so these things are within our grasp. We were able to make certain changes in Ontario. Maybe I was able to champion a lot of the stuff because I do come from an immigrant background, and there was a personal motivation behind there. But we were able to move the yardstick significantly than ever before. So change can be made, which we have to participate and we have to act as well. And I want to acknowledge that peaceful protest is part of that as well. It's part of our democratic process. And these conversations is part of the process as well. I'm not suggesting whatsoever that we put all that aside, because that's the feeder for all the information, for the motivation, and the desire for change that needs to be had.
Thank you for that. I know that Anthony Bailey has reached out to us and has asked to speak about his church's experience with restorative transformative justice. And so if the organizers can, it would be great if Anthony, if Reverend Bailey could be unmuted and could be brought to the fore.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the contributions that were made by our esteemed panelists and the conversations that have taken place in the chat. Very instructive indeed. Thank you very much for that. I want to be brief, but as thorough as I can in sharing a personal experience and the contrast of two experiences. One, some of you may know, but not all, and I'm not trying to be melodramatic, but I want to use it for the purpose of contrasting what may happen. When I lived in Montreal, my brother and I were attacked on the streets of Montreal by racists. They were using the N-word and they hated Black people and so forth. They attacked us without provocation, killed my brother, stabbed him through the heart, bled to death in my arms, and the trial was a sham. An agreement was made between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, and they made a deal without consulting us, and it was just a terrible experience. Now, fast forward to about 4 years ago, we had our church, Parkdale United Church, attacked twice in 1 year with racist graffiti, and also a threat of violence against me. The young person who perpetrated this as well as defacing synagogues and mosques and so forth, was underage. And as a church, we decided that we wanted to understand something about this person and the hate within them and how they came to be this way. And so I had an opportunity to meet with the person in detention and have a conversation with him, a very difficult conversation. He was filled with not only racism, but white supremacy, and he had been indoctrinated and so forth. What happened, he went through the trial, and we worked with Collaborative Justice at City Hall and said, you know, we do not want to give up on this person. We as a congregation have been wounded. A number of Black and brown people in our congregation were traumatized, our children in particular, some of the youth who felt our church was a safe place and that it somehow didn't feel that same way. So there was a cost to our congregation, a cost to me and to others. But we made a commitment, which is part of our theological understanding, our religious framework, is to try to find a way to meet this person and to see what kind of transformation might be possible. And so we entered into a collaborative justice relationship with the workers at the Collaborative Justice and this young person. We did not come and meet our congregation, but we communicated back and forth for 3 years. For 3 years, we made a commitment to work with this person and to see them transform from this white supremacist that hated all kinds of people, Black people, Jews, and so forth, to watch over time writing essays on Black people, doing research, trying to figure out how to move his particular perspective. And the way in which we reached out to him through the intermediary, I guess, as I mentioned, we never met, was to offer him grace, offer him forgiveness, offer him a willingness to recognize his humanity beyond his actions and demonstrate that we're not going away. Initially, there seemed to be a kind of a pushback, but we said, we want to be here for the long haul with you. And over that time, we supported this person in terms of getting employment, in providing materially for his employment work, and continuing to encourage him, have dialogue back and forth, and to the point that after 3 years, he said he could not believe a community that he had injured so terribly would want to stay with him, to help him, and to establish a relationship. And so after that period of time, he renounced his white supremacist views. There were some issues within his background and so forth, began to find some healing and counseling, and has gone on to be a productive person in society, regaining some of the passion he has as a young person to kind of help other people and so forth. And it was a very powerful story. It is not without cost, as I said, to our community and to the way in which people felt by what happened. But I think that this is an example of how a relationship in a sense was restored, and that there was some transformation taking place. Also, some of the systems that were in place actually learned some lessons also about how to provide and how to make more available these options rather than incarceration. So I just wanted to share that contrast between what I experienced as a teenager in the justice system and what we were able to enact with this person over a period of 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Bailey, for that recounting that inspiring set of circumstances. It's very impactful and is a different model in terms of moving forward. We had a question from Lisa Pascal. How can we force change and accountability within the current statute, the Comprehensive Police Services Act, and encourage an investigation of police services on the incidents of differential services and treatments stemming from systemic racism, gender bias, marginalization of the vulnerable and disadvantaged, and general misconduct that is incongruent to public service? And so I don't know if anybody is willing to take that on, but it's looking at the Comprehensive Police Services Act.
Ralston, I did want to jump in, and it might partially answer Ms. Pascal's question. I wanted to jump in actually earlier following Lawrence's comments with respects to the precedent that has been set.
Sorry about that.
No problem. I was quiet about it. Stealth in the chat. The precedent that's been set in terms of establishing, making sure that the justice system takes some accounting for Indigenous persons, and I'd like to say that that's actually happening. I don't know if folks noticed the statement that came out in the summer with respects to the members of Black Caucus, federal members of Black Caucus statement on addressing systemic racism that was signed by a number of parliamentarians. But there are a couple of pieces in there that focus on criminal justice reform as it pertains to Black people and Indigenous people. So over the last couple of years, and some of the work that I've been doing has been to try to influence some of the work that's been going into the House with respects to criminal justice reform. And so I got tapped on the shoulder by the Deputy Minister of Justice to come in and assist on some of the work that's being done here. So I without telling a lot of stories out of school, I would like to say that that work is ongoing to make the same kind of allocation in terms of the historic, taking into historic realities of the Black experience in terms of the sentencing and engagements with our people within the justice system, Black people in particular, in order to address the representation. Myself and maybe a couple other people that I'll be bringing in, I think will help to have people that are on the inside that have the sensitivity to be able to address those issues, and hopefully at the end of the day, make legislative and policy changes that cascade down through the federal system and hopefully influence provincial, the court system, where we're also being disproportionately impacted. So just suffice it to say that that work is ongoing, and I'm just at the beginning of impacting that work within the Department of Justice. And just lastly, before I jump off, in terms of the story and the restorative justice story that Reverend Bailey shared with us, it's so very true that when we are able to have our oppressors see our humanity, it helps to humanize. They get their humanity back, I think, and that helps with the work. And again, that's why I think that this historic moment in time, where there are so many white people chanting Black Lives Matter over the summer, like that groundswell of support, I'm hoping is irreversible, and that people that are on this line and people that are engaging with this work ongoing, who are not necessarily part of the Black or Indigenous communities, will align with us again to do this work. And I think, and many of us feel, it helps white and other racialized communities to reclaim their humanity back after being part of, in most of the times unwittingly, being part of an oppressive system that's been keeping us down. So again, restorative justice, yes, all the way. Community engagement, the only way to make real change.
Thank you for that. And I do believe that there is a question in French, and Lucille was going to read the question and I believe also translate it for our panel.
Okay. Okay. I'm not really finding the question in French. I had one on my own, if you allow me.
Oh,
donc, ma question, c'est une question un peu ouverte sur le potentiel de vraiment effectuer des vrais changements au niveau de l'éducation, en assumant, premièrement, que les enfants naissent pas racistes, que l'éducation, c'est le meilleur moyen pour changer les comportements futurs dans la société. Alors, je voudrais savoir ce que vous en pensez. On a des changements à faire maintenant au niveau de notre société existence à tous les niveaux, mais au niveau de l'éducation, est-ce que vous croyez qu'il y a vraiment un effort significatif qui vaut la peine de mettre? So to recap my question, so I want to talk and I want to hear you maybe about your opinion or your vision about bringing about like real change in the education system, because in my opinion, kids, children don't, they don't come in the world racist. It's something that somehow they get influenced into, that they learn. So do you believe that, and I'm assuming that, of course, and I'm totally agreeing that we need to address changing in a society at all the different levels, but do you agree that addressing changes in our education would actually assist in a meaningful way to change the world of tomorrow? So just want to hear you on that, because I've been putting a lot of focus on that myself. So
I for one, if I may, I can't imagine that there's anybody that wouldn't be in favor of updating and improving the education that students across the country get, insofar as our Aboriginal history and culture and the impact and history of Blacks and people of color in this country. I can't imagine anybody wouldn't be in favor of that. But I'd like to throw out another little thing for people to think about, and that is that, as you say, I don't think that that they're learning to be racist in school. I think they're getting it at home, and I think that the recent example that happened in Russell is a very good example of what happens not in school, because the two boys that attacked the other Black boy, I don't imagine they got their racist and hateful thinking from the classroom. They got it in their home. They got it from their parents. They're ignorant, racist parents. So while education is a very positive thing, I think we have to figure out a way to go after the parents. Change the way that the parents are acting, change the way that they're bringing up their children in a racist fashion. And
but don't you believe, though, if we don't want those children to become like their parents, we need to teach them somehow to think differently?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I don't imagine there's anybody on this call that would say otherwise. Mm-hmm. But I think the real problem is that, kids are born, as somebody mentioned earlier, kids are born, they're good. They're good from the start. How do they, by the time they're 8 or 9 or 10, how do they attack a Black young fellow on a bicycle and jump on his arm and break his arm? How do they get to that? They don't get that from school. They get that from home. And I think we got to go after the parents.
Well, if I may, and I agree with you to a point, Lawrence. People do get it at home, but the education system reinforces and perpetuates white supremacy in so many ways. At the end of the day, for kids that get spit out of that system, we have white racists and we have Black and brown people who end up internalizing the racism that they've learned through the system. And I know, because my dad taught in that system, I went through that system, and I've watched my children go through that system, and have had to analyze the impacts on my children and our friends, other racialized friends, in terms of what's happening to them. The research is clear. You put white teachers, this is another discussion, by the way, but you put white teachers with a white curriculum, and you do not have the only brown people and Black people in a school are the janitors, you reinforce a reality for those kids, and they pick up difference like there is no tomorrow. So yes, absolutely, school does have a profound impact. If we go back to the roots of schooling, kindergarten is a German word that came from the Nazi propaganda machine to manipulate children against their parents, right? So, you know, that's the model of schooling. So I've got a lot of problems with schooling. It's probably why, mainly why I homeschool my children. But it's very true that the reinforcing of all of these ills is done in the schools inadvertently through well-meaning teachers and well-meaning administrators. The curriculum, what is taught, how it is taught, and probably most importantly, who is teaching and not teaching. How is it so difficult to get a Black teacher in some of these schools? It's almost impossible based on the rules that they have in place. So yes, schooling is really key. And if we could all homeschool, and the folks are on this line, they're all woke and they're all down with the cause, our children would all be sort of wonderful and transformative in their thinking. But most of the children in the school system, and we're struggling with it now, that my daughters are in that school system now, they're struggling with the lack of representation, the lack of, you know, the reinforcing of these norms. Like, what is the history curriculum in this country? They're now getting imbibed with a lot of the Indigenous history, but Black history is still optional. So people don't know about the enslavement of Black people in this country. People don't know about our many contributions. So yeah, I agree. It is those racist parents that, you know, helped indoctrinate those kids, but they're not getting anything. They're not getting what they need from the schools to help counter that. And it's not the school's responsibility per se, but I think that schools reinforce the dichotomy between white and Black, white and Indigenous, white and everybody else, and the other, through very exclusion in terms of education, curriculum, and so on. But it's another discussion. It's really important.
I think it's very complex as well. And I want to put something out there that's quite personal, and actually maybe one of the reasons why I really want to try to bring a change. My father, he passed away, but my father was racist. My father raised me with saying things in the house that would make your toes curled. And I'm totally the opposite. And I don't know where it happened that I realized that that was not all right and that needed to change. And it was to the point where I wasn't talking to my dad anymore for the last 20 years. My dad never knew my 4 children because I was so against the way he was thinking. So you know, that's why I have a lot of faith and a lot of hope that, you know, it's not because your parents are in a certain way that you cannot be better than that. And that's why I'm talking about education as a way to foster the compassion and the understanding that we need, you know, to implement so that we change the world of tomorrow. Anyway, I'm sorry, I got a little bit passionate there, and I want to let the other people speak.
And I know that we are reaching approximately when we were supposed to end. So I would like to thank our panelists for an exciting and dynamic conversation, but I will invite them, because I see some hands up, to make some closing remarks. So we apologize that we couldn't get to all the questions, but I think that this is demonstrative of the real importance and the interest in this topic matter around justice and police reform and systemic racism. And it's an ongoing conversation that our communities will continue to have. And it will continue on for a short while longer with wrap-up statements from our panelists.
Ralston, I'm a strong believer in, if you tell the truth long enough, eventually people will figure it out. And I think we need to be more honest with our kids and forthright about telling the truth, whether it's history, context, all of that. And whether it's Black, yellow, brown, Indigenous, we have a responsibility to tell the truth. And when you look at restorative justice, I think one of the things that people don't recognize is that it is a very hard process to confront yourself. You're bringing 2 parties together. It's about accepting responsibility and the consequences of one's actions. And it is focused on healing, but it is very much about restoring balance. And it had a bigger reference in terms of community, at least in the Indigenous community, in terms of the cultural context of restorative justice. But it really is about a collective investment. And when the Reverend spoke about the process they went through with that individual that damaged the church, it was an investment by the community and by the church to see somebody get lifted up. And right now, the existing system is only about getting a pound of flesh and retribution. And we need to change as society how we look at valuing other people and providing dignity and fairness. And sometimes you got to give a little bit to get more. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your contribution. I know that we are short of time, so I'm going to ask our speakers to try to really create a synopsis remark as quickly as possible. If we can have it in 30 or 60 or 90 seconds. I see Diabo shaking her head, so I think you should go next.
You know what? That should teach me, because in school, whenever I made faces, I would get picked first. But you know what? Je vais répondre ma question en français au début, c'est juste pour répondre à Lucille. Et après, I'll do my closing in English. Okay? But I think it's just important that I mention this. J'ai appris que j'étais noire quand j'avais 8 ans, quand je suis arrivée au Canada. Je ne l'ai jamais su. J'ai toujours cru que j'étais une femme, une jeune fille somalienne, musulmane. Mais dès que je suis arrivée au Canada, j'avais 8 ans, en 1996, je crois, ou 94. On m'a dit que tu étais une femme noire. On m'a dit, Dabo, tu es une petite fille noire. Je ne l'ai jamais su. Alors, c'est vrai que oui, il y a des choses qu'on apprend à la maison. Oui, il y a des choses que nos parents nous apprennent. Mais on passe la majorité de la journée à l'école. Quand mes nièces et mes neveux rentrent à la maison, c'est à 6 heures de l'après-midi, 8 heures de l'après-midi, 8 heures du soir, ils dorment. Alors, il y a peut-être 2-3 heures qu'ils passent avec leur famille, mais le restant de la journée, c'est vraiment avec l'école. Alors, pour moi, le problème avec le système d'éducation, c'est que on dirait que le système commence à construire des identités pour nos enfants. Et si on regarde les stats, en ce moment, le nombre de suspensions qui existent et d'expulsions pour les enfants noirs, surtout, c'est très élevé. Alors, je me demande ce que le système de l'éducation peut faire pour commencer à établir une identité plus positive pour nos enfants. Comment est-ce qu'on peut regarder aux administrations, non seulement aux administrations, mais les profs. C'est des enfants qui sont maltraités, c'est des enfants qu'on leur dit vous êtes différents. Alors, oui, c'est vrai que on passe du temps avec nos familles, c'est vraiment la fondation de la manière qu'on est élevé. Mais à partir de 5 ans, on est à l'école. Alors, t'imagines, à 5 ans, on t'apprend que tu es noir, on t'apprend que tu es différent. Et si jamais tu fais quelque chose de mal, tes conséquences sont un peu plus différentes que les enfants qui sont alentour de toi, qui sont peut-être des enfants qui sont blancs. So I won't recap that in English, to be honest. For those of you that didn't understand it, I apologize. Thank you for the conversation. I think this was a really incredible and lively one. I do like the rawness that came out of this conversation. I was so preoccupied in reading the chat that I was trying to focus and read that, but I think that it really does speak to the need that exists in our community for change. And I think that there's ways that we can make an impact greater than ourselves, so that when we leave this earth, we've left a footprint. That we can honor each other's legacies. You know, when I look at all of you and I look at myself and I remember my father who died in Civil War, I want to carry that legacy. And I think we all need to honor each other in that space and really live in a place where our humanity is what resonates more than anything else. So thank you for the opportunity. And I'm sorry, Ralston, I really tried to do that fast. I was speaking in English, thinking in Somali, and then I had to switch to English. So I apologize, but I hope that I left something with all of you tonight.
No, that's fine. At council, I'm learning something about something that's called the Cullen Rule, which gives everybody 5 minutes. I am a chair of a committee, and I believe in being lenient, so I often go beyond that. I think that people need to be heard. This is a very serious conversation, and thank you for your contributions. Let's call on Parinka. We have not heard.
She had to leave. She had
Oh,
something at 8:30. So
okay. Okay. Well, how about Lawrence?
I don't have a lot more to say other than I think now is the time. When people around the world are marching, black and white and people of color are marching, now is the time. If there's ever going to be a movement to real change, and what I mean by real change is not just meetings and further discussions, and if there's going to be real change to the institutions that have caused and have become part of the injustice that we see and that our fellow citizens are experiencing, if there's ever going to be change, the time is now. So I urge all of the people on this call, many of whom are respective leaders in our communities, to keep up the fight. We eventually are going to prevail. Thank you.
Thank you. And Yasser.
Thank you. I just want to just say it's a privilege to be part of this discussion, and I want to thank Rawson, you and Lucille, yourself, and your entire team for organizing and hosting this. And thank you for taking your responsibility and your duty to public seriously by engaging in these important conversations. And hopefully we have given you enough to take bits and pieces of it at the least and push the agenda forward. Thank you, merci beaucoup.
Thank you. And I believe Richard has the last word, I believe.
And I will be very brief. It's been a pleasure being on this program with all of these fantastic leaders. Appreciate the invitation, Lucille and Rawson, to speak to everyone today. I'm very encouraged. I like the call to action. Lawrence, I wasn't beating up on you, Lawrence. You've been a gift to our community, so I wasn't beating up on you. I'm just passionate about education. But again, I think that there are a number of leaders on this call, but I think that I would like to extend that. It's something that I call collective leadership, where we don't need to depend on individuals to lead groups, but we can all take our part in moving change from whichever vantage point that we are operating from. And we support those people that we put in leadership positions in our churches and in our councils and in our mosques and so on. And we support them from our positions within the community. So what I'm hoping for is that you support those of us who are still working very hard, sometimes in the belly of the beast, with your voices on the outside. Has an enormous amount of resonance and power within the bureaucracies and the institutions that we're working in. So again, thank you again for this opportunity. It was a great event. I'm going to go eat my supper now and kiss my kids, and hope to see some of you guys in the near future.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you everybody for this wonderful, informative conversation. In order for us to really have meaningful change, this is what I truly believe in politics. We need to have maximal community input and then really reflect the policy decisions that are made based upon that input, especially input that gives more voice to equity-seeking groups. Because if Black Lives Matter and Indigenous lives matter, Black voices matter and Indigenous voices matter too, and they need to be impactful in terms of the policy prescriptions that come before governments. So I really do thank Lucille for this opportunity to moderate this event. It's been an honor and a privilege with this esteemed group of panelists, and I turn it back to our MPP for Ottawa-Vanier, Lucille Collard, for closing remarks.
Merci, Ralston. Et je vais être aussi brève parce que je sais qu'on a dépassé notre temps. Je ne suis pas du tout déçue de la discussion qu'on a eue ce soir. Je suis vraiment satisfaite d'avoir mené à bien l'organisation de ce forum qui me tenait vraiment à cœur. Puis, j'en profite pour remercier les panélistes qui se sont joints à nous ce soir avec des témoignages vraiment touchants, empreints de plein de honnêteté qui m'ont très touchée. Je veux remercier également tous les participants qui se sont joints à nous ce soir. On en avait près de 120 à un certain moment donné. Il y en a qui ont dû quitter parce qu'ils ont dû avoir faim aussi. Mais je ressors de cette soirée avec encore plus de motivation de faire tous les efforts nécessaires pour apporter les changements dont on a besoin, pour apporter ces changements positifs dont on a parlé. So in conclusion, I just want to thank all the panelists for your contribution tonight. It's been very insightful, enlightening, and I did appreciate all the passions that, we've seen. That was the object of the discussion. And now I really feel fueled to go on and, work on these positive change that we've talked about. And I'm pretty sure that, these conversations are difficult conversations, but I still think that they are important to have because it just raises awareness, and also the exchange of ideas just can bring us somewhere else as well. You've shared some ideas tonight that I hadn't thought about. So, again, it was very positive, and thank you everyone for being there. And I look forward to the next opportunity to exchange again on this subject. So merci beaucoup and bonne soirée à tout le monde.
Awesome. Right.
Thank you, Lucille. Before everybody goes, we usually ask everybody to unmute themselves to say goodnight properly. And also for Liam, who works with Lucille, to take a couple of photos of the gallery just so that he can keep it for posterity. So if everybody would like to unmute themselves, Liam?
Yes, so if we're going to take a picture right now. If you would like not to be in the picture, just turn off your video camera and you will not be included. If you would like to be in the picture, turn it on and I will do my best. We have a lot of participants though. All right, so everybody smile. We're going to take a few. So 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Okay. And then we hop over to the next page.
Gallery view?
Yeah.
Gallery view. There we go.
And then 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. If everybody would like to unmute themselves and say good night. Good night for me. Good night.
Good evening, everybody.
Bonne soirée.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.